The papers were already signed before Lena realized what she had done. She sat in the parking garage of Whitmore and Associates for 11 minutes after her lawyer walked her to the elevator, engine off, hands in her lap, watching the concrete wall in front of her like it might say something useful. It didn't. Nothing did. The folder was on the passenger seat, pale beige, a single silver clip holding 40 pages together. And she couldn't look at it, couldn't throw it out the window, couldn't pretend it wasn't there. 14 years. That's what fit inside, a pale beige folder with a silver clip. She drove home on autopilot, took the long way through Cabbagtown, past the park, where she used to walk their dog before the dog died, and Elliot said they shouldn't get another one because they were too busy. She'd agreed. She agreed with a lot of things that turned out not to be agreements at all. Just her, quietly setting down another piece of herself so the room would feel more comfortable for someone else. The house was half empty when she walked in. Elliot had been efficient. She'd give him that. His side of the closet was bare. The espresso machine he'd bought with his own credit card was gone. The framed photo from Banff, the one where they were both laughing and her hair was a disaster from the wind, was gone too, though he'd left the nail in the wall. That bothered her more than she expected. The nail in the wall, all by itself, with nothing to hold. Lena Calloway sat down on the kitchen floor and didn't cry. She thought she would. She'd been bracing for it all week. The way you brace for a needle, shoulders up around your ears, breath held, but nothing came. Just a long, strange quiet, and the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a streetcar somewhere outside. She was 37 years old, and she was starting over, and she had absolutely no idea what that meant. People talk about betrayal like it happens in a single moment. A text message, a lipstick on a collar. Something cinematic. What they don't tell you is that sometimes it's slower than that, a long, quiet erosion, like water wearing down limestone, until one morning you look at the person across the breakfast table and realize the shape of things has changed so completely you can't even point to when it started. For Lena, it started, or maybe it ended, on a Tuesday in February. She'd come home early from a site visit. The Garfield project had been canceled. The developer had pulled funding without warning, and she'd sent her team home and driven back to the city with that particular hollowness that comes when something you've spent 8 months building disappears in a phone call. She was a structural engineer, and cancellations were part of the job, but this one had felt different. Personal somehow. Like the ground had shifted, she'd expected an empty house. Elliot Hartley Moore's car was in the driveway. So was a car she didn't recognize, black. Quebec plates. She'd stood on the front step for a moment, keys in hand, breath fogging in the cold, before she understood what she was looking at. Then she went inside. She didn't make a scene. That wasn't who she was. She just walked past the living room, past the dining room, up the stairs, and she heard them before she reached the landing, and she came back down the stairs and sat on the bottom step, with her coat still on, for a very long time. His name was Elliot Hartley Moore, and she had married him when she was 23, and put him through law school while she finished her own degree, and he was a senior partner now at one of the most prominent firms in Toronto, and he had been sleeping with a junior associate named Serena for the better part of a year. Lena found that out later, the year part. He told her himself, actually, which she supposed was something. He was very calm about it. That was the thing she kept coming back to. How calm he was, like he'd rehearsed it. Like he'd already moved the furniture in his mind and he was just waiting for her to catch up. It got serious, he said. I didn't mean for it to. She wanted to say something sharp and devastating. She didn't. She said, okay. Then she called a lawyer. The next few months had a texture like wet sand. Everything heavy, everything slow, nothing quite holding the shape you pressed it into. She threw herself into work because work was the one thing that made sense. Load-bearing walls made sense. Stress calculations made sense. A beam either holds or it doesn't, and if it doesn't, you find out why and you fix it. People were considerably harder to engineer. Her sister Bonnie drove up from Hamilton twice a month and made pasta and said things like, "You're going to be fine," with such ferocity that Lena almost believed her. Her friend Priya called every Sunday morning from Vancouver, always at 9 a.m., always with coffee, always letting the silence sit without trying to fill it, which was the more useful gift. She did not tell anyone how bad the nights were. She did not tell anyone about the morning she stood in the shower until the water went cold because she couldn't figure out why she should get out. Or the afternoon she drove to the Scarborough Bluffs and sat on a bench for 2 hours watching the lake, not thinking anything in particular, just existing in a way that felt barely held together. She was managing. That's what she told people. She was managing. Then, 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, she started throwing up in the mornings. She thought it was stress. Then she thought it was a virus. Then she bought a test at the Shoppers Drug Mart on Bloor with her hood up like a person who had done something wrong. And she sat on the bathroom floor of her half-empty house with the test balanced on the edge of the tub. And she stared at 2 lines and did not move for a very long time. She had told Elliot she was ready for children. She'd said it for years. He'd said he wasn't sure, wasn't ready, maybe in a few years, maybe when the firm was more stable. She'd waited. She'd been patient. She'd been so relentlessly, quietly patient. And now, she was 8 weeks pregnant, alone, in a house with a nail in the wall and no photo to put on it, and the father had already signed a separation agreement and moved Serena into a Yorkville condo. She sat on the bathroom floor for a long time. Then she stood up, washed her face, made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened her laptop. She didn't call Elliot that day, or the next. She needed to know what she wanted first, before anyone else got to have an opinion about it. What she wanted, she realized. Slowly, over a week of early mornings and long silences, was this baby. These babies, as it turned out. She went to her first ultrasound alone, fully expecting to get through it the way she'd gotten through everything else, with her jaw set and her hands steady. And the technician had been very professional and very calm when she pointed to the screen and said the word twins, but Lena had made a sound she didn't quite recognize, something between a laugh and a gasp, and she'd had to press her fist to her mouth. 2. There were 2. She didn't tell Elliot. Not then. She needed time to understand what she was holding before she handed it to someone who'd already proven he didn't know how to be careful with things. She moved into a rental in the annex, a bright, slightly crooked Victorian semi with a sunroom and creaky floors, and a landlord named Mr.OliverStories, who brought Optimos from his garden all through August. She painted the second bedroom a soft sage green. She assembled a crib, 2 cribs, by herself, using an instruction sheet that fell apart every time she unfolded it. And she swore at it quietly and methodically until it was done. And then she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd built, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. She was building something that she understood. Work had started again in earnest by then. A new project, a mixed-use development in the distillery district, had come through, and it was complicated and demanding, and exactly what she needed. Her team was small but good. She'd been with the firm, Alderton Structural, for 11 years, and her colleagues had the grace not to ask questions and the decency to keep her calendar full. It was through work that she met Callum Reed. He came to a site meeting in October, 8 months after the divorce, representing the development group behind the distillery project. She'd seen his name on the correspondence, Reed Capital, but hadn't put much thought into it. She was used to developer representatives who were polished and impatient and not particularly interested in what engineers had to say. Callum Reed walked into that meeting and asked better questions than anyone she'd worked with in the last decade. He was tall, serious-faced, with the particular quality of stillness she'd learned to associate with people who actually listen. He asked about the foundation work, about the load distribution on the south-facing wall, about why she'd chosen the approach she had for the underground parking structure. Not to challenge, to understand. He took notes by hand. After the meeting, he held the door and said, "That was a good call on the parking. I read the original proposal and couldn't see why they'd gone with the other approach. Now I can," she said. "Most people don't read the original proposal," he said. "I always read everything." She didn't think much of it. She went home, made soup, fell asleep on the couch with her hand on her stomach, which was now very obviously a stomach that was doing something significant. He saw it, of course. She'd been in her second trimester at that point, and it wasn't something you could miss. He hadn't said anything at the meeting, and she was grateful for that, in the professional way. You're grateful for someone following normal social protocol. 2 weeks later, he called the office, her direct line, to ask a follow-up question about the south wall. Then he called again the following week about the timeline. And then once more, not about the project at all, just to say he'd passed the site and noticed they'd broken ground on the east side, and he wanted to make sure the timeline they'd discussed was still holding. Her assistant Jess gave her a look. Lena said, "He's a client." Jess said, "Mm-hmm." She told Elliot about the pregnancy in November through her lawyer. She had her reasons for the timeline. She'd spoken to her doctor, spoken to her own counsel, and by the time the formal notification went through, she was in her 26th week. She was also, by that point, deeply clear on what she wanted. Full custody, no complications, a clean line. She'd expected him to fight. He didn't. What she got instead was a phone call. Not through lawyers, he called her directly, which she hadn't expected, and he said very quietly, "Are you healthy? Are you okay?" She said yes. He said, "I'm sorry." A pause. "I know that's not enough." She said, "No, it's not." And then, because she was done performing graciousness for his comfort, she didn't say anything else. She let the silence sit, and she waited for him to figure out what to say next. And she felt for the first time in a long time that she was standing on solid ground. He signed the amended agreement. Full custody to Lena. Reasonable visitation to be arranged once the children were born and she'd had time to settle. He didn't negotiate. He didn't argue. Maybe he understood, or maybe Serena had already given him something else to organize his life around. Either way, Lena didn't lose sleep over it. The girls arrived on a Friday afternoon in January during a snowstorm that had been making the radio anxious for 2 days. She'd had Bonnie with her, and Priya had flown in from Vancouver on the Thursday just in case, which turned out to be the right call. They were there, both of them, in that small bright room, and when the nurse placed the first baby in her arms, and then the second, Lena looked down at 2 small furious faces and felt something rearrange itself in her chest that had no name she could put to it. Nora and June. She'd had the names for months. She'd written them on a post-it and stuck it to the bathroom mirror in the annex, and she'd looked at them every morning while she was brushing her teeth, making sure they still felt right. They did. They felt exactly right. Bonnie cried, which was expected. Priya cried, which was less expected. Lena didn't cry, not in the room. She'd used up whatever was available for crying somewhere back, in the fall, in bits and pieces, on drives home and in the shower, and once, memorably, in the parking lot of an IKEA at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. Instead, she just held them, one in each arm, and she felt her shoulders come down from where they'd been living for approximately 14 months, and she thought, here we are. Callum Reed sent flowers to the office when Jess let it slip, which Lena suspected was less a slip than a deliberate act of mild treachery, and then sent a short message. "Congratulations, I hope you're resting." She was not resting. She was functioning on 4-hour increments and had spilled coffee on her laptop twice and was deeply reliant on a whiteboard calendar system she'd designed herself to keep track of feeding schedules. But she was, in her own way, thriving. She went back to the distillery project in March, part-time at first, then full. The south wall was exactly as she'd calculated. The underground parking had come in clean. Small victories, but real ones. Callum came to the March site meeting and the April one. He'd taken to arriving a few minutes early and making coffee in the site trailer. The small drip machine that everyone ignored, and having a cup ready when she arrived. He never made a thing of it. He just had it there. She started arriving a few minutes early, too. They talked about the project, mostly. About the city. About a book she'd recommended and he'd actually read. About the fact that he'd grown up in Fredericton and hadn't meant to end up in Toronto, but the city had a way of deciding things for you. About Nora, who was already showing signs of opinions, and June, who slept through everything, even the fire alarm in the annex one Tuesday morning at 3 a.m. He listened the way he read things, carefully without rushing, like what you were saying was the thing that mattered most right now. She noticed it. She tried not to notice it too much. What she hadn't expected was that Elliot would resurface the way he did. She'd thought, assumed, that the terms they'd agreed to would hold. And they had, legally. But Elliot Hartleymore had a way of filling up the edges of things, of occupying whatever space hadn't been explicitly closed off. He started calling more regularly. He said he wanted to be involved. He said he'd been doing a lot of thinking. She believed that he meant it. She also knew that Elliot's thinking had a way of circling back to Elliot. He came to see the girls in April, which she had agreed to. He was good with them, actually. She'd expected him to be awkward, to hold them at arm's length, the way he held most things, that required a kind of softness he'd never quite developed. But he sat on the floor of the sunroom with Nora on his chest and June in the crook of his arm, and he looked, for the first time in years, like a person who was present. She didn't want it. She wanted her feelings about Elliot to be clean and simple. The kind that fit into a folder with a silver clip. They weren't. They never had been. 14 years meant the feelings were structural, load-bearing, woven in, not the kind you could pull out without affecting everything around them. But she knew something now that she hadn't known back in that parking garage in February of last year. Complicated didn't mean stuck. Complicated just meant you had to be more careful with the math. She met with her lawyer in May, updated certain provisions, made sure the terms about decision-making were airtight, medical, educational, the things that actually mattered. She wasn't punishing Elliot. She wasn't building walls. She was just making sure the structure was sound. She ran into Callum outside the site one Thursday in May, not a meeting day, both of them there by coincidence. She'd been standing at the fence, looking at the east wall, which was up now, clean and straight and doing exactly what she'd designed it to do. He'd come from a meeting 2 streets over, he said, and he'd wanted to see it. They stood there for a while, looking at the building. "It's good work," he said. He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said most things. "It is," she agreed. He turned to look at her then, not the building, her, with an expression that was careful and direct, and very much not pretending to be anything other than what it was. He said, "I'd like to take you to dinner." She looked at him for a moment. The city was loud around them. A streetcar, a courier on a bike, someone's music from an open window. She thought about the nail in the wall with no photo on it. She thought about Nora's face when she was surprised, that sudden magnificent widening of the eyes. She thought about the drive to the Bluffs 18 months ago, sitting on that bench barely holding herself together. She was not that person anymore. Or she was still that person, but she was also someone else now, someone who had built 2 cribs from a disintegrating instruction sheet, and designed a parking structure that came in exactly right, and raised 2 daughters through a snowstorm January, and come out the other side knowing, in her bones, what she was made of. "Okay," she said. He smiled then, a real one, the kind that reached. He didn't say anything else. She went home that evening and fed the girls and put them down and stood in the sunroom for a little while in the quiet dark, listening to the city outside. The sunroom smelled like the tomatoes. Mr. Okafor had started planting again in the window boxes. The 2 cribs were in the next room. The whiteboard calendar was full. The nail in the wall of her old house had been on the staircase landing, east-facing, probably driven in sometime in the 1980s by someone who'd long since moved on to somewhere else. She thought of it sometimes. Not often. Less than she used to. There were things you left behind not because they didn't matter, but because you had finally run out of reasons to carry them. There were things you set down not in anger, but in the kind of tiredness that comes after the last bit of holding on. When your hands finally open and you realize, standing up, walking forward, breathing in, that you're lighter than you've been in years. She turned off the sunroom light. She checked on the girls. She went to bed. Outside, the city carried on the way it always did. Indifferent and alive, and full of people who were somewhere in the middle of their own particular rearrangements, their own structures being tested, their own walls going up and coming down. Tomorrow there would be work. There would be Nora and June in the morning, small and furious and entirely themselves. There would be a Thursday dinner to look forward to in the cautious, clear-eyed way that she was learning to look forward to things. That was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was a beginning.